wanted to bring to your attention, I put out the program for tonight, and also I put in next year's program. And if you look at that, you can see there's 1 month that I don't have a person yet. And I'll be working on that and get that done shortly. But I wanted to throw that out to our members here, that if anybody has a talk that they want to do on January 23rd, it's open and it's first come, first serve. So if you see me after the meeting and you want it, you can have it. Okay, on to our speaker. This is on the architecture of Glendora and appreciation. While Glendora is not known for its architectural collection, this final program of the Society Year will demonstrate that our city does, in fact, possess some noteworthy architecture, both in terms of styles, representative of the time periods over which Glendora developed, and also some homes designed by prominent architects. This presentation will reveal some of these important examples, discuss the geographical distribution of styles, which allows us to read the landscape and better appreciate the growth of Glendora, and encourage citizens and visitors alike to explore the city at ground level. Steve Slakey is Executive Vice President of our society. He is also a tour docent for the Los Angeles Conservancy. He is Senior Adjunct Professor of Geography at the University of Laverne and is retired from 35 years as a geography and social science teacher at La Puente High School. He is past president of the California Geographical Society. Professionally, his focus is urban geography. The great Steve Slakey.
I think I'll quit while I'm ahead. Yep. Fixing here. Okay. Excuse me. Good, thank you. We'll run through this, and we have a little surprise for you at the end that's tied in with this. So, as Jim said, and I've actually gotten an email earlier today, and someone tonight asked me, are you going to talk about such and such a house? And for the most part, I'm not. This is going to be kind of an overview. The idea being that you'll go out and explore and understand more of what you're seeing in the built landscape here. And as Jim also said, we don't have a lot of architecturally significant things here, but we have more than one might think. So that's what we're going to explore here. Okay, so this basically summarizes what Jim said. And as a geographer, we're trained to look at the landscape, whether it's the physical landscape or the built landscape, and look for patterns. So when it comes to the built landscape, one of the things we like to do is to look at architectural styles, because certain architectural styles tend to be associated with certain time periods. We'll talk a little bit about that shortly here. So once we know that, then we can travel around an area and actually look at a community like this one as if it were rings in a tree, because certain types of dwellings tend to concentrate in certain areas because of the time period. It's not as clean as that, but it works pretty well. Okay. The inspiration for this goes back a few years. Back in 1983, a fellow by Jonathan Grinder was a history major working as master's at UCR. And he worked with the city and a group of volunteers, of which I was one, to do a survey of historic buildings in the city. And at the time, I was at La Puente High, I was teaching a sophomore urban studies class. And every fall I was thinking, what are we going to do in the spring for a project? And we did come up with a number of things. One of the things we did another year was actually develop a 20-year city plan for the city of La Puente, which was kind of cool because I got an award for that, and a cash award. And that actually eventually led to my being an exchange teacher in the Ukraine. Our product is over out there on the right. We surveyed all the pre-1950 homes in La Puente, which there are about 298. Now, the inspiration for this program was the fact that this building that we're in right now is celebrating its 50th year. Now, we're not promoting the idea of making this an official historic property. That's not going to happen. But this was kind of the springboard for what we're doing here. Now, I mentioned some basic architectural styles. One that we find several examples of in Glendora is the Victorian style. And crossing my fingers here, yeah. So basically built between the 1860s and 1890s. A few years either side of that, particularly 1880s to 1890s is primarily when these were built. So if you see Victorian homes, you can pretty much guess that they were built in that time period, and that's when, if you see a cluster of them, when that area of the city was built. Some of the key features, one is, this is like my cable TV thing here. And at this point, I just hand it over to my wife and say, you do it. Anyway, one of the things that characterizes the Victorian is a strong vertical component. This is particularly because of the high ceilings, 10 or 12-foot ceilings. Honest to God, I'm gonna kill this. Okay, a steep pitch gable roof, narrow eaves, okay, as one can see here. Okay, they tend to be highly decorated, as most of you are aware, with various types of shingles, turnings, corbels, such as we see here, and so on. There's a number of iterations of Queen Anne, which is the most elaborate, the Italianate. We're going to see Italianate style applied to other buildings as we proceed here. What's called stick, and also East Lake. Now, the example I have here is not local. Actually, it's in Oakland. You see something, we'll have the, instead of having the quiz at the end, we'll just do it during the course of the presentation here. So what do you see that doesn't belong in one of those buildings? Wasn't original. Oh boy, we have a tough audience. My 10th graders didn't have any problem with this. The garage, yeah. How many cars were around in 1910 or 1890? Okay, there were a few actually, but that's a later development here. A couple of Glendora examples here, which you may be familiar with. The Mita House is a classic example. The Lester West House is kind of a combination of Craftsman and Victorian. The classic box is just that, a box, usually 2 stories, but also we find single story. The example here is I think a good one, basically a cube roof. That means there's a slant on all 4 sides, usually a dormer here in the ceiling, in the roof, and a wood exterior, usually shiplap or shingle. This example is in Raleigh, by the way. A couple of examples here. I think the one over on the right is really, even though it's not 2 stories, is a classic example of the classic box. The Glendora Land Office is kind of a combination too, the box and Victorian, kind of a transition. Now, one style we have a lot of around here is the Craftsman. And if we could keep it on the right slide, it would work. Basically built from about 1905 to the 1920s, oftentimes the late 1920s. A low-pitched gable roof, as you see. One of the key characteristics of this style is a porch across, usually all the way across the front of the building. Strong horizontal aspect as opposed to a vertical aspect. Ground hugging profile. The notion behind the wide eaves was to shade the building during the summer, but allow light in during the winter. Oftentimes you get a dormer, as we saw previously. There are other kinds of materials that are used basically as wood frame houses, but you'll find clinker brick, which is a type of brick that is on the outside of the brick pile in a kiln, and it tends to get burned and distorted. It's very distinctive. And those types, usually they're thrown away, but they were used architecturally in the style of building. Stone, blaze style, built-in furniture oftentimes. And this style grew out of the arts and crafts movement in Scotland and England. William Morris in England, Charles Rennie Mackintosh in Scotland. If you ever get to Glasgow, go to the Rennie Museum there. It is phenomenal. Plus, there's a beautiful botanical garden about 2 blocks from there. Couple of examples here. The guardhouse on Glendora Avenue and this other dwelling on Foothill, but we have a lot of these around. And finally, the Spanish Revival or Mediterranean, popular in the 20s and 30s, leading up to the Second World War. The upper left here, some good examples. Basically, the idea here was to replicate mission style. That is, instead of using adobe walls, these were wood frame with stucco painted white to simulate the adobe walls in the missions. The arcades, or the do this with trepidation here. Here it was a common feature, as you can see this. We have a little tract of houses going on here. Another variety of this, another permutation, is the Mediterranean style, which had a flat roof and some tile trim. One thing you might notice here, this guy, there we go, was way ahead on drought prevention here. And I grew up in Oakland. These are both in Oakland, by the way. And there was another house, Mediterranean, in fact, in North Oakland. And same kind of front lawn, green concrete. And a buddy of mine said, you know, I drove by there one time. Honest to God, he said, there was a lawnmower on the front yard. Which would be kind of cool, actually. So some Glendora examples here, a couple of Mediterraneans and a Mission Revival. Another example in the 30s and 40s, leading right up to World War II, was the period revival. And a number of architectural historians suggest that with the Craftsman, which was really Americanized, in fact, the Craftsman was considered one of the first American style of home, that there was a reaction to that. And the reaction was this period revival approach to things, which basically drew on European themes, particularly from the Middle Ages, which seems really a great time to replicate. I mean, it was so progressive. But there are tons of permutations of these things, and we have a number of them here in Glendora, 2 shown down below here. One of the things that characterizes a number of these, neither example I showed here, but up above here is the half timbered look, which is reminiscent of what was called in the Middle Ages wattle and daub architecture construction, but which meant that you built the frame of the house, and then within the gaps, you put woven twigs. That was the wattle. And then you would plug mud into those. That's the daub. That's what that term means. But we will have a vocabulary. Okay. And although I don't know of any examples here in Glendora of the witch's hat, you do find these in some of these homes. Absolutely no reason why you would have that. Okay. Maybe that's out of the Middle Ages too. That particular example is in, I think, Santa Maria is where I took that picture. California Ranch. We got tons of these around here. And look at the time period, 50s to 90s. And what happened in this community is that it grew to a certain point up to World War II. And then after World War II, exploded. And when it did, the style of choice was generally the ranch. Okay. And look at the example we have here. has a garage. Now the garage is actually an integral part of the building. I might point out with Craftsman houses that most of those were built without garages. And then people, if they wanted a garage, they added it. Sometimes they stick build it, or you could actually order kits from organizations like Sears, for example. They deliver a kit for a garage and put that sucker together. But the garage was not an integral part of the house construction during that period. It became so after the war when we had an explosion in the number of motor vehicles. And it's reflected in other ways as well. Look what's happened to the porch. 1920s, porch extended all the way across the front of the house. Now, the only reason it's there is because you have to get into the place. Otherwise, it's irrelevant, basically, because what's going on? Well, one thing that's going on is right there, TV. People are inside. They're not out on their porch greeting their neighbors. And if they're not inside, where are they? In the backyard, barbecuing. And I can remember as a kid, and probably some of you can too, when you got your first barbecue back in the 50s. So here are a couple of examples here. Like I said, there are hundreds of examples, great many permutations. There are a few other designs that we might want to be aware of. There aren't as many examples here in town, but they're worth noting. The Venberg building here is really what we call a vernacular brick. The term vernacular is really handy for architectural historians. Well, we can't quite figure out what this guy is, so it's vernacular. Vernacular wood frame, vernacular brick, etc. Okay, so we do have a number of those downtown. You never thought that was architecturally important like that, did you? Neither did I. Italianate, the Visiting Angels building, which was formerly a home, is a good example. Flat roof and kind of a horizontal aspect to it. The City Hall, I guess you really could say, is more vernacular than Italianate, but it's often described as being Italianate. What makes it Italianate is the roof treated like this and these corbels that support the roof. But look what else you have here. You have the tile roof, which really is not Italianate, and you have these classical columns here. So it's really more vernacular, but it sounds cooler to say it's Italianate. Okay. Yeah, going back to that study that my students did of houses in Loch Lomond, there are a lot of houses built during the citrus area that are just essentially boxes. So I don't know, I think we identified like 90 vernacular wood houses. I don't know what, Mr. Slakey, what is it? Well, what do you think? Does it fit any of the categories? No, it's vernacular. Prairie style over here is kind of a permutation really of the Craftsman style. And it oftentimes I should say, Frank Lloyd Wright is credited with that. And he designed a number of so-called prairie houses, particularly in the Midwest. Probably the best example is the Roby House in south side of Chicago, now owned by the University of Chicago, I believe. And then the Monterey Colonial, which we have very few here. I can frankly only think of a couple offhand. But you do find it, and you find it in other communities. So actually, I'm hoping you'll take these ideas and kind of apply them to other places as you travel around. So what are we dealing with here? Well, there are a number of criteria for historic buildings. One of them is that it should be at least 50 years old. Well, that's no problem. Almost all the buildings in this town are 50 years old. Okay, so you live in a historic building. It was built in 1908. Well, it's different. But exemplify or reflect special elements of historical, architectural, archaeological, cultural, or aesthetic heritage. We try to make these things as narrow as possible. Are identified with persons or events significant in local, state, or national history, embody distinctive characteristics of a style, a type, a period, or method of construction, or are valuable examples of the use of indigenous materials or craftsmanship. And finally, are representative of the notable work of a builder, designer, architect. We're going to look at some buildings tonight that fit those criteria, which aren't necessarily identified as historic buildings. One of the advantages of having your dwelling identified as historical is the trade-off is you have to maintain the exterior, but you can change the interior, and you do get certain tax breaks. That's really the incentive to get involved. The area that's outlined in red here is the official boundary of the historic district, Glendora Historic District. There have been attempts to create a couple other districts in the city which have failed because a majority of the property owners have to agree to participate, and that hasn't transpired. The area outlined in yellow contains most of the buildings that built before the current year, before 1960. And actually really before that. And so we're going to take a look at some places within this. Now, obviously there are newer buildings. There were groves that weren't converted to residential until relatively recently. So you have recent architecture within so-called historic areas as well. In the process, we probably ought to make a point of the historic streetlights, of which there are roughly 100 in the city. And the city has acquired funds, at least partially. The actual cost of restoring these is a little fluid at this point. But the city is making an effort, passed a resolution in the last council meeting to proceed to restore these lights. The hope is that the city can acquire additional funds, restore these lights. By the way, they're wired with 2 wires. There's no ground. That's why they were shut off. Because you and I would probably be dealing with a lawsuit right now. So somebody would touch the thing and you have to literally get electrocuted. So that's why they were shut off. And they've been shut off for about 20 odd years. But if the city succeeds in doing that, then the lights have to be put within, to be maintained, have to be put within a lighting district. We have one lighting district in the city, which has annexed different areas of the city over the years. The hope is that by paying all the restoration fees up front from the city and from there's a grant from the state that we've received, that the property owners will only have to pay the maintenance and basically the electrical cost. And there are some good arguments for that. One is that these will enhance the area historically. They're both in the historic district and in the southern portion of the area that's outlined in yellow here. Secondly, it's been pretty well demonstrated over the years that areas that have good street lighting tend to have less crime. And I live in an area where the voters turned down, actually even before we moved in 1973, had turned down participating in the lighting district. And one of our neighbors the other night on their Ring doorbell saw a guy lurking around and casing the cars next door because it's pitch black. So but the coyotes love it too. Okay, so that's something that's in the pipeline, we hope. Okay, now you may ask, well, how do I find out where these places are? Okay, good question. One, over on the right there is a walking tour guide that when we had a historic preservation committee here in town, John Lundstrom and I were on it among others, we put this little brochure together. And it's available online, both on the city website and on the historic Glendora Historical Society site. The one on the left is available also, or will be on the GHS website. It's not up there now, but we're creating a category to put this in. And I thank Barrett Oliver for scanning that, thanks. But these are two good sources. There are a couple of errors in the one on the left, but they're relatively minor. There's a map in there where you can locate these places. And if you were wondering how many properties are identified as official historic properties in the city, the number is 35. And one of those is the fig tree down across from Glendora Hospital. It's not, they're not all houses. Now some examples, just to kind of get an idea of what you might find if you wandered around within that area that's outlined in yellow. We have the two Victorians. We have a ranch house next to a Spanish revival. And we have Mrs. Bunn's maternity hospital on Mita. I said, there's always a bun in the oven. And the Sedum house, which is adjacent actually to the Bunn house. And Miss Sedum was the first librarian of Glendora. I bet there wasn't any talking in that library. What? Is that the way you run things now, Cindy?
Clearly.
Yeah.
One of the loudest ones in the building.
Yeah. Okay. This is an edge transition area of the historic area. This is over on the west side. In the foreground is a classic box, and then a vernacular Victorian, which has been stuccoed and frankly really screwed up. And then a Mediterranean, you see the tile roof there, and then a Craftsman. So you can look for things like this. And you do get this mix, which tells you what? Tells you that these were built at different times, that the box and the Craftsman, or the Victorian rather, were built first. And perhaps there was an orchard to the north here, and then that later was converted. Likewise, here, this is within that area. And what do we have here? 4 Craftsmen, a period revival, and vernacular shingle. Where is that? Okay, some notable structures. We have to put in a pitch for Rubel Castle here. And we are doing tours again. You can make reservations online. The Hamlin Home, which is the DAR headquarters. Boulder Grange, which is Lafayette Senior Center. And the Bidwell Law Office and home. Real good examples of Craftsman. Okay, and some others. The Lachance Estate of Leodora and Lorraine. You may not recognize it because they've just painted it black. Okay, well, charcoal. Okay.
Yeah.
Charcoal, I'm sorry. Yeah. It's rather jarring, actually. But it was built, Lachance was in the lumber business, and I believe this house is constructed entirely of redwood, which was not uncommon at the time. The Goff House was originally located down where Albertsons is, on that piece of land. And then the decision was made to move it to its present location. And the grandmother in the family was not real thrilled. I think she was probably related to Miss Sedum. And so she refused to get out of the house. I guess it was kind of a sit-down strike she was perpetrating. So they bolted her chair to the floor and strapped her in and moved the house. So there. And then they proceeded to expand the house. It's really well kept, well maintained. And then we'll find around town, as you're no doubt aware, a number of orchard houses. Most of them are Craftsman or a kind of a vernacular Victorian, but these are 2 examples, and you'll find these surrounded by more modern homes, which tells you, hello, they were orchard houses, and then that land was subdivided. We have what we have today. Now, we have 3 places that by notable architects in town. One is the Rowley House, which was designed by Cliff May. Cliff May is considered the developer of the concept, at least, of the California Ranch House. He built a large number of houses in the Long Beach area, both stick built and some prefabs. I think this might have been a prefab, I'm not sure. I have to do more research on it. But it's noteworthy because he's associated with it. The Sally Rand House, we did a presentation on that a number of months ago. I can't remember exactly when it was, but it was brilliant. Well, actually, we were photobombed, and that was kind of nasty. But we got through that, and it is available, I believe. Is it available on YouTube? Yeah. So, and the designer of that was Foster Rhodes Jackson, who frankly I'd never heard of until I started to research this place. And he did a lot of work in the Claremont area, particularly. And in fact, the Claremont Heritage, their historical society, picks up interns from the Claremont colleges, and they had one of their people do or a couple of them do a listing of Jackson houses in Claremont, which there are quite a few. Also a disciple of Frank Lloyd Wright, which the house was certainly a reflection of. It's long gone. About 50 years ago was demolished. The so-called Singer Mansion, which is really more properly the A.K. Bourne Estate, was designed by Wallace Neff, who was considered the architect of the stars in his time, particularly before World War II. A lot of what he did was Mission or Spanish revival. So this one is kind of unique in that respect, in that this is more, frankly, a colonial revival, almost a mission or a Monterey revival home. And we have a couple of examples of mid-century modern houses in the town. One group is up on in the 600 block of East Mountain View and East Dalton. There are 12 houses total up there. And they were designed by these three architects, Conrad Buff, Calvin Straub, and Don Hensman. And they were all students in the USC School of Architecture at the time. And they were hired by a contractor by the name of Britton to design and I was going to say design and build, but Britton did the building, of course. They're all pretty good examples. But it's significant. These guys all went on to significant careers in architecture. And then over on Poppy Lane and Lone Hill is another cluster of mid-century moderns. And these were designed and built by a guy by the name of Webster Wiley, who was self-trained both as a contractor and as an architect. He did a lot of work up in the La Cañada, Pasadena area. And his houses are sought after there. And you might notice the prices here. Only 6 left. $21,000. To buy a lawnmower. We'll have to put that concrete lawn in. He did a lot of construction, like I say, over La Cañada area. And in the process of getting involved in this, I got an email from a guy who lives in a Wiley house over in La Cañada. He had been looking for a house for like 8 years because he was really turned on to mid-century modern. And he finally started going door to door, literally asking, would you want to sell your house? And he finally found somebody who did. They shook on it, sold. And he spent the last 8 years restoring it. And that's how frankly, I never, honestly, I shouldn't admit this here in front of all of you. But I never paid that close attention to this area until he sent this email, and then we started corresponding. Hey, this is really interesting. What's also interesting, though, 2 things is one of the ads here. There we go. Yeah, there we go. By the time we're through, I'll just figure it out. This is the ad, one of the ads here for Glendora. And, there we go. But I want you to check this out. Built to the highest standards of construction, carefully restricted. Meaning, unless you were Anglo-Saxon, you weren't going to be able to buy there. And that was not unique. And I have to tell you that I didn't know anything about this kind of thing until I was in grad school about 3,000 years ago. And I was in a seminar where we had to do a study on some community in Los Angeles area. I did Irwindale, a friend of mine did Signal Hill. Somebody else did Newport Beach. And that's where I first heard the term. You couldn't be Jewish and buy in Newport Beach, specifically restricted. Now, look at the ad over here, LA Times, April 30th, 1961. Each one of these ads here was for a housing development in those cities. El Monte, West Covina, a couple in West Covina, Arcadia, Glendora. It was a happening time. Now, I've talked to some of the folks over there on Poppy Lane, and they say, oh, I'll ask them, do you know who designed your house? And they'll say, well, it's an Eichler. Well, it's like an Eichler, but it isn't. Okay. And that term gets tossed around. Eichler was a prolific home builder, mostly in the Bay Area, particularly in San Mateo, and then up in Sacramento. San Mateo, I think he did a tract like, ultimately it was like 1,000 houses. The guy was really significant. And I not only, well, look at the second paragraph here, that he aimed to construct inclusive and diverse planned communities, ideally featuring integrated parks and community centers. And he established a non-discrimination policy and offered homes for sale to anyone of any religion or race. In 1958, he resigned from the National Association of Home Builders when they refused to support a non-discrimination policy. And this was around the time that Prop 48 showed up on the California ballot, supported by the California Real Estate Association, to create a constitutional amendment to allow discrimination in housing. It was ultimately declared unconstitutional. These two places in the bottom here, these examples, the one on the right is in Sacramento, the one on the left is San Mateo. And lest you think there's only one castle in this town, there are more, because there were the castles of Brigadoon, okay, north of Route 66, off of Glenwood, and there's a cluster there, and there's one of the examples. And then I threw this in because it's just unique, and I wish I could learn more about it. I've been scouting around, and Karen Garcia has been helpful in this quest. But a Russian Orthodox community moved here in the 50s. And I didn't know when they had moved here. I knew there was this community, and of course they have a Russian Orthodox church there. But I never exactly figured out how they got there and why. I always assumed they were white Russians that escaped from the Soviet Union in the 20s, as a number of people did. There's a large community in Sacramento that developed in that way, but evidently not. And apparently these people left Russia or the Soviet Union after World War II and settled in what apparently was a civilian conservation corps camp in Pomona, and then a Quaker group lined them up with jobs in the orchards, and they created this community here. The house on the right there, lower right, was supposedly roughly where Armstrong Nursery is now, and it was moved. I kind of doubt that, because in order to move it, they would have had to go west on Gloucester, north on Lorraine, over to Valley Center. That's kind of a circuitous route to move a house, but maybe they did. Makes an interesting story anyway. So thank these people for helping me out with this, and like I say, happy exploring. All right, now Cindy. Cindy has something special that segues